Hello, this video is the first in our series about colonial America. And so we're looking at the colonial times, which stretch in this period too for a push from 1607, which is the founding of the colony of Jamestown, which is the first permanent colony in America, to 1754, which is the beginning of the French Revolution. And it's important to note that there are three different types of colonies as we go through these videos. The first is proprietary, where there's an individual that obtains a charter and creates the colony. The second is a joint stock company, where businessmen pool their resources together to create a colony. And finally, royal, which is a direct control of the crown. So we're going to launch into the Chesapeake colonies, and throughout this series, you'll learn more about other colonies that exist. But it is important to know that both the Chesapeake and the Southern colonies are sometimes looped together. I'm going to do them separately. But when you think of these two different sets of colonies, you do need to realize that there's a plantation economy happening in both the Chesapeake and the Southern. And this includes large cash crops such as tobacco and rice. There is going to eventually, throughout both of these sets of colonies, going to be slavery. And there's going to be a hierarchy in society where the plantation owners are largely on the top. They're sparsely populated compared to other regions of the colonies at this time, where they're not really going to have a lot of churches and schools because they're too expensive to build for these small spread out towns. There is religious toleration, including the fact that they worship the Church of England, or also known as the Anglican Church. And there's really an attitude of expansion. When we get to talking about tobacco farming here in the Chesapeake, it's very depleting to the soil. And so they're going to need more land in order to continue to farm. But that is going to lead to conflicts with Native Americans. So let's get into the colonies. Virginia and Maryland are the two we're looking at right now. And so this is the Chesapeake in the 17th century. So you can see that the yellow is all that was settled by 1650. But within 50 years, there's a huge, much larger area that's been settled. And we're going to talk a lot about Jamestown there as the very first colony down in 1607, and just getting an idea of how these are all largely colonies that are created along these water routes is an important thing to understanding why they're able to grow crops and all that they do. Let's get into the settlement of Virginia specifically. The context that is happening at the time is that James I becomes king in 1603, so just 4 years before this, and there is a tremendous population growth. There's also, unfortunately, an economic recession, which means that there's a lack of work and things are not going as well as they would hope for. So there is a process called primogeniture, and that's the idea that the oldest male son inherits the land from their father. This means that other individuals, other sons in the family, don't get anything. And so there's a lot of also competition that's happening from Spain at the time. So that leads people to want to look elsewhere, be able to get their own land. So Jamestown becomes the first permanent British settlement in the New World. It's founded by the Virginia Company, which is a joint stock company that receives a charter from King James I in 1606 to establish settlements in North America. The benefits of having this Virginia company is that there are over 100 men who paid into this company, kind of like a corporation today. And this minimizes the risk and maximizes the profits. In order to get to America, the journey took 4 to 5 months, and there were 3 ships that went. Their main goals were actually to make money. There was the promise of gold. They also were interested in converting Native Americans to Christianity, and they also were looking for passage through North America to the East Indies, largely known as the Northwest Passage. The individuals that came on these voyages consisted largely of very well-to-do individuals, meaning they had a lot of money, and they were adventurous. The Virginia Charter gave these settlers the same rights as Englishmen in England, and it became the foundation for American liberties. Similar rights would be extended to other North American colonies. However, Jamestown was racked by tragedy in its early years. They suffered from famine, which means there wasn't enough to eat, disease, and war with Native Americans. They nearly failed due to unrealistic expectations. Remember that these were individuals who were largely from well-to-do families. They were not used to working. In fact, they had very little interest in actually growing foods. Where they chose to settle was a poor location. I showed you the map that showed that they were along stretches of water, which might seem to be a good thing. However, this was tidewater, which means that it was a mixture of salt and fresh water. There were mosquitoes that were there, and we know mosquitoes can bring diseases. And the brackish water did not allow for things to be grown easily. There was also a lack of leadership, as there was no one to kind of take the reins and organize everyone, and there were ongoing conflicts with natives. In the first year, out of 114 people, only 34 survived. Only 60 of the original 400 settlers survived the starving time, which lasted from 1610 to 1611. The reason for this starving time included diseases such as malaria, dysentery, the brackish water, which they couldn't drink, and there's even evidence of cannibalism. By 1625, only 1,200 of the nearly 8,000 colonists who had come had survived. At this time, the low life expectancy continued into the 1700s. The reorganization of the colony began when Captain John Smith said, "He who will not work shall not eat." And it's him who saves them from the starving time. He looked at everyone who refused to work and said, "Fine, then you will not get to eat." And this worked. His leadership helped Jamestown survive. Yes, a lot of people died during the starving time, but more would have without his leadership. He was kidnapped in December of 1607 by the Powhatans, led by Chief Powhatan, who subjected Smith to what many might have called a mock execution. Smith was perhaps saved only by the daughter of Powhatan, whose name is Pocahontas. Now, Disney gets some things wrong in their movie and their portrayal of Pocahontas and John Smith's relationship. The reality is, when she saved John Smith, she was only 12 years old. She was not a grown woman as portrayed in the movie. She does, however, become a central figure in preserving the peace in early Jamestown. She provided food to settlers. She became a hostage of colonists in 1613 during military conflicts, and later married not John Smith, but John Rolfe, and taught him the way of curing tobacco. She died of smallpox at the age of 22 in England. One of the things that you're going to look at today in the activities is, why did so many colonists die? And you're going to be able to examine some primary sources related to the starving time. John Rolfe. The biggest question that he looked at was, how do we make the colony profitable? They needed something to trade and export. This caused changes. They needed money and workers to grow. So John Rolfe introduced a new, tough strain of tobacco, and it became perhaps the most important reason for Virginia's survival. The tobacco industry became the cornerstone of Virginia's economy. It was a different kind of gold. Remember, those early settlers were looking for gold? Well, they certainly found it in the amount of money that was made from tobacco. Here are some statistics that show the information about it. In 1618, Virginia produced just about 20,000 pounds of tobacco, which is a lot. But if you consider that it's going to increase in 1622, it's going to be triple what it had been just 4 years earlier, with 60,000 pounds. In 1627, it's now 500,000 pounds of tobacco. And by 1629, just a little over a decade later, they're producing 1.5 million pounds of tobacco. So this is a huge crop for them. It is very labor intensive, however. And so in 1619, the first slaves are going to arrive. There's 20 of them sold by a Dutch ship. By 1650, there's 300 slaves. Now, how are they going to get individuals? In order to create 1.5 million pounds of tobacco, they're going to need people here. And there's only 300 slaves. That's not a lot of people, and that's by 1650. So the way that they're going to attract colonists is through two systems. One is called the headright system, and the other is indentured servitude, and they go together. And this is forced labor, but it's initially done through a system of voluntarily for giving their labor. So the idea was that a person who paid for passage, the headright system would allow them to say, I will pay for you to come to America and to work for me for 5 to 7 years in exchange for getting 50 acres of land for myself. So the headright system is benefiting the employer in this case. The employee is the indentured servant who agrees to work for 5 to 7 years in exchange for passage. Unfortunately, many of them will die from disease, from attacks, and also overwork. In the early 17th century, so the early 1600s, they were given money, land, and supplies once they were freed of their contract. By 1700, there were about 100,000 indentured servants. About 75% of all English immigrants to Virginia and Maryland were indentured servants. As the colony grows, there are more conflicts with Native Americans. They're moving inland into what is known as the backcountry, which increases tensions with the natives who already live there. In 1610, Lord de War offered colony the reinforcements. They became ruthless. There are attacks of natives, and they destroy the food supply. And he orders the Virginia Company to get rid of Native Americans because they are attacking the people and they're destroying their food. This leads to a series of 3 wars between 1610 and 1646, known as the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. There are approximately 15,000 Powhatan natives. There's lots of villages. They're collectively a tribe. Eventually, these wars will lead to Powhatan's removal from eastern Virginia. The first one is in 1610 to 1614, so it lasts for 4 years. And what leads to the end of it is the marriage of Pocahontas and John Rolfe, and it is considered the first interracial marriage. There's still lingering tensions, however, because they want more land. And I'm going to continue talking about this as I go through. So in 1622 is the Powhatan Uprising. This is going to bankrupt the Virginia Company, and about 300 plus colonists are going to die, almost 1/3 of the English-speaking population at that time. There are 3 reasons, we call them the 3 Ds, why the long-term resistance to the English is going to fail. The first of these is disease. Remember when we talked about the Columbian Exchange, how one of the unintended consequences was the arrival of diseases such as smallpox and malaria, and that this was going to decimate the population. Remember, 90% of the population within the first century. In addition, there is disorganization. There's a lot of tribal rivalries, and it's very hard to organize the tribes into a unified resistance to the Europeans. And finally, disposability. The Europeans do not see a need for them and see that they are in the way of gaining land. Now, this is very important to stop right here and think about how this is different from the previous group that we had talked about of the Spanish colonists. The Spanish wanted to work with natives. They wanted to Christianize them. They wanted to create these villages. They wanted them to work for them. In addition, you have these interracial marriages and relationships that are happening that led to those mixed groups such as mestizos. But you don't have that with the English. The English see them as on their land, in their way, and wanting to get rid of them. In 1644 is the Third War, and that is, again, trying to get rid of the natives, and this one seals their fate. And there's no real resistance left by this time due to disease and the fact that war has decimated the natives. One of the things that characterizes the social unrest of the late 1600s is the struggle between the backcountry individuals and the more perceived elites of the coastal area. And one of the most significant events during this time period is called Bacon's Rebellion. It happens in 1676. By the late 17th century, there were large numbers of indentured servants who had come. And remember, originally they were promised land and all of that once they were freed. Well, as the settlement grew, there was less land available for these individuals. And so most of them start to move to the backcountry area. And they resent the planter aristocracy to the east. They resent these big plantation owners. They're not gaining access to these large land grants that they were told that they would get. And they're forced to become squatters for land in the western part of the colony. Well, over there is where the Native Americans are, who are going to resist white expansion. And so you're going to see a situation where the Indentured servants, the former ones, the freedmen as we're going to call them, become angry with the government of Virginia that they won't protect them from Native American attacks. Governor Berkeley, who was in charge of the colony, was generally friendly toward Native Americans, and especially those who traded. He didn't see all Native Americans as problematic. He saw those as attacking, potentially problematic, but a lot of them were good individuals who traded and were beneficial. So he refused to order attacks on Native Americans that cooperated with the government. However, those in the backcountry, those individuals like Nathaniel Bacon, saw all natives as enemies. Nathaniel Bacon was an aristocrat in Western Virginia. He was a member of the House of Burgesses, so he was part of the government, and he began mobilizing a militia to protect whites from the natives. He hated the governor and was mad that he had no land, that they had no land. In 1676, his militia massacred natives and set fire to Jamestown, ultimately forcing Governor Berkeley out of the city. Bacon's rebels were opposed to aristocrats and natives both. He subsequently died of disease, and Berkeley crushed the rebellion. However, this is extremely significant in the fact that the planters saw white indentured servants as too difficult to control and significantly increased the importation of Black individuals to be enslaved while reducing the number of indentured servants who came. That is the significance. This leads to the change from indentured servitude to Black slavery. The planter elite after this will continue to play poor whites against Black individuals. They will fear Blacks and poor whites both, that they could somehow form an alliance in the future. So that's why they would play each other. The planters effectively controlled the poor whites psychologically by emphasizing that they, no matter how poor they were, would always be superior to Blacks. So again, just to reiterate, it's the first largest rebellion in the colonies, both politically and socially. It pits the eastern elites against the backcountry farmers. We're going to see this happen again in other colonies, and it's the catalyst for the transition from indentured servitude to slavery. The House of Burgesses is a legislative assembly that was created in 1619. It's the first colonial parliament in the British American colonies and the first instance of representative self-government in the colonies, so it's extremely important. However, most representatives were large, wealthy landowners, so it wasn't really representing those backcountry farmers we just talked about. It was created to attract settlers to Virginia by this idea of offering more liberty to them. The lower house had 22 representatives where each settlement voted. The citizens got to choose. And this idea is only found in the British colonies. It's kind of a degree of freedom, considered kind of a baby parliament. But even though it was originally a joint stock company, James I is going to revoke their charter and put them under royal control in 1624. That House of Burgesses is largely a reason why, but so is tobacco. The king believed that the assembly was too seditious, meaning that it was potentially could plot to overthrow the king, and he didn't like that at all. He didn't want them making that much decisions on their own. Also, he really, really, really hated tobacco. Virginia then becomes a royal colony directly under his control. And it goes back to that idea of mercantilism that I talked about in a previous video, where their sole purpose now becomes the benefit of the British. And they're not only in it for themselves. And that's the Virginia colony. Moving on to Maryland. The context behind the creation of Maryland is that Catholics had become a minority in England. They have some political power, but they fear the Protestant majority may try to take away their rights. And they see that Puritans were in control of the English government. So Charles I gave Sir George Calvert, who is the first Lord of Baltimore, a portion of Virginia for the creation of a Catholic haven and for creating profit. Eventually, the growth of Protestants meant that Catholics became a minority, and again, they're fearing for their loss of freedom. They will cultivate tobacco, which is similar to Virginia. And in 1649, they're going to create the Act of Toleration. This is going to grant toleration for all Christians, but it's going to institute the death penalty for anyone denying the divinity of Jesus. This includes Jews and atheists. The motive of this is for Catholics to seek to protect their own faith by granting a certain degree of religious freedom. One of the similarities that you will see between this act of toleration here with Catholics, as well as the Puritans and the actions that they take, is that when they talk about toleration for religion, they're really referring to themselves and not to everyone else. It's not tolerance in the terms of the word, the definition we would use now. But ultimately, Maryland does become the largest haven for Catholics in the British American colonies. And finally, life in the Chesapeake. Disease was devastating early on. It took 10 years off the average life expectancy. There's malaria, dysentery, and typhoid. Half of all those born in early Virginia and Maryland did not live past the age of 20. Less than 25% of men lived to see their 50th birthday, and women only their 40th. Most immigrants that came here were single men in their late teens and early 20s. Most died soon after arriving. Surviving males competed for extremely scarce amount of women. Women married early. Some came over as tobacco brides even. Women began being recruited early on to come to Virginia, and settlers would have to pay their travel costs with tobacco. Most men could not find mates as there were too many men and not enough women. The region stabilized eventually due to increased immunities to diseases and the rising influx of women. By 1700, Virginia was the most populous colony with about 50,000 colonists. By 1700, Maryland was the third most populous colony with about 30,000 inhabitants. And that is the Chesapeake Colony. The next video will be on the Southern colonies. Thank you very much.